Hello and welcome to my video on the social learning theory. As I said in my last video on the behaviourist approach, this is designed primarily for the AQA A-level specification, but will apply to other A-levels and general interest as well. This video follows directly on from the behaviourist approach. We looked at operant conditioning, classical conditioning, and this all comes under that first bullet point there of the learning approaches. But this is the second half of it, and this looks at, as I say, the social learning theory. Okay, the first thing to say about this is the big difference between the other two approaches, classical conditioning and operant conditioning, and social learning. Classical and operant conditioning, they both happen directly. Okay, that has to happen to you. So if you're associating one thing with another, you have been in that environment like Pavlov's dogs. The dog heard the bell and they salivated afterwards once they paired that. And again, in operant conditioning with rewards and punishment, you as an individual, that has happened directly to you. You have received the reward or you have received the punishment, and that has either increased or decreased the behaviour to happen. The approach that the social learning theory takes it one step further. It says, well, actually, these things, these behaviours, these experiences don't necessarily have to happen directly to you. You could potentially observe things happening to other people and learn that way, and that actually makes a lot of sense if you think about it. You don't necessarily have to put your hand in the middle of a bonfire to know it hurts and to know it would harm you. You maybe have seen someone else maybe burn themselves on the hob or burn themselves on a candle, and you think, oh, I'm not going to do that, because when they did that they started crying on the floor. And so you're observing other people's behaviour. Happens with rewards as well. You maybe see someone else get a reward. So the Olympics are on at the moment in Rio, and you see Michael Phelps stood up there getting his gold medal, and you think, oh, actually that's pretty damn cool, I want that. And so you maybe copy the behaviours that are happening there. That's the basic idea of the social learning theory. It's happening through others. There are some key terms that you really need to know that link into that. The first one is imitation, and that obviously the basic of that is copying behaviours of others. If you imitate behaviours, if you see someone getting lots of really good A grades in their essays, and you know that they spend an hour doing their homework at night, you copy that and you do that behaviour. And the second is identification, and this is quite a key one, quite important, and again makes a lot of sense. Basically, identification says if you can identify with someone, if you see yourself more like them, you're more likely to copy that behaviour. So males would be more likely to copy another male, females would be more likely to copy another female, you'd be more likely to copy someone of your own age group than you would your grandparents' friends, and again that makes a lot of sense. So identification is quite a key thing in the social learning theory. Things you identify with, you're more likely to copy. Modelling is the next term here, and so a model is someone you base your behaviour off. So you would imitate, so imitation would come from a model, and again that model you're more likely to identify with someone close to you. So the model is the person presenting the behaviour. So and yeah, you would imitate a model as well. Vicarious reinforcement, really important term. You need to write that one down. So we've looked at positive and negative reinforcement in operant conditioning. There is this other type of reinforcement known as vicarious reinforcement, and this comes from the social learning theory. And what vicarious reinforcement is saying is, well, yeah, it's not happening directly to you, but you see someone else get rewarded and you want that reward. So you copy that behaviour. So it's the observation of others being really reinforced. Could happen with punishment as well. You see someone else being told off, or you see someone else getting a negative outcome. You don't want that, so you won't do that behaviour. Okay, so that's what vicarious reinforcement is. It's watching others be rewarded or not. And the last part, and again really important parts of social learning theory, it's known as the mediational processes or cognitive mediational processes. And cognitive, we haven't looked at the cognitive approach yet, but cognitive is thinking. Okay, and what this says then is that there is a little bit of thinking involved in the social learning theory. So it's not just observing a behaviour then copying it. You need to think, right, okay, can I actually do that? So have you got the skills to be able to copy that behaviour? I would like to be like Lionel Messi. Not going to happen because I've not got the physical skills. So I might observe him winning the Champions League, and then think, right, I'm going to do that, and then realise that I'm crap at football. Attention is another part of the mediational processes. So you watch someone maybe make a really good, I don't know, shot in pool, and you think, oh, I want my ball to go in the hole like that one did, but you weren't paying attention, so you didn't see what that person did, and so you're maybe not able to copy that behaviour, imitate that behaviour. Retention is another thing. Do you remember how to do it? So it could have been that you were good at riding a bike. I know you're meant to be able to ride. If you learn to ride a bike, you're meant to be able to ride it. But the first time you get on a bike after maybe 5 years of not riding it, you think, oh, can I actually remember how to do it? So retention is a key part of the mediational process as well. I've said reproduction. Are you actually able to physically reproduce that behaviour? And then motivation. Are you really that motivated to be able to do it? So I mentioned Michael Phelps. Do you really want to get up at 4 a.m, 7 days a week for the next however many years to be able to even have a chance at being as good a swimmer as he was? And so there are lots of factors. You don't just see an event and copy it. The mediational processes come in. You think around it. If though that is possible. So again, I'll relate it back to maybe doing A levels. You see someone else get lots of A grades. You know that they work really hard. You think, right, maybe I should actually do a little bit more homework, and you see your grades increase because you've paid the attention. You're retaining the information more. You're able to reproduce that behaviour, and you've got the motivation. Okay, so lots of parts to the social learning theory. And it says there this occurs between stimulus and response. So you see the event, that's the stimulus, and the response is reproducing it. So that's where the cognitive mediational process happens. You see it, you then think about it, and then you're able to respond or not. So next we'll look at a famous bit of research that's been done into the social learning theory. Okay, so the key study that you need to know in terms of the social learning theory comes from a psychologist called Albert Bandura, and this is his famous Bobo doll experiment, which took place in 1961. And the aim of the study, a couple of aims, they were looking at this social learning theory, so looking if children learn through observation. They were also looking at aggression. And so basically what happened, they put children aged between 3 and 5 years into a room with this Bobo doll, and a Bobo doll is a big kind of inflatable doll that looks a bit like a clown. There's a picture of it there on the right hand side, and there are a couple of situations in which they were put in the room with a doll. Either they had just observed an adult acting quite neutrally towards the doll, and then they looked at the children in there, or the children had just watched the adult being aggressive towards and attacking the Bobo doll. So the adults punched and kicked, and they hit the Bobo doll with a hammer. They shouted at the Bobo doll. So they wanted to know what the child would then do when they were then introduced to the Bobo doll. And what they found, unsurprisingly, was that when the children who had observed the adult being aggressive towards the doll were then put in the room with the Bobo doll, they imitated that behaviour. So this supports the idea of social learning theory. What we see, we then do. What they found was that effect was stronger. There was more imitation when the adult was the same sex as the child. So when a boy had observed a male adult, and when a girl had observed a female adult, they were more likely to copy the behaviours. The interesting thing was when the other group who hadn't seen the aggression, when they were introduced to the Bobo, they didn't do those behaviours. Okay, so it suggests this social learning is going on. It's kind of known as monkey see, monkey do. We act the way that we see things. It was actually a different finding than they expected at the time. What they expected at the time was when we're aggressive, or when we see aggression, it reduces our aggression. It almost it's cathartic. It releases the pent up aggression. So it was actually a surprising finding at the time. They didn't expect the levels of aggression that they saw. So what happened then after this, they conducted a few different types of experiment using the same sort of thing. So one of the variations, they, instead of actually observing the adult there and then, they watched a video recording, and they either watched the adult as they had been, but it was a video recording, or they had like a fantasy character. So basically the adult dressed up as a cat. And what the aim of that one was to see, well, if children are watching TV and fictional characters being aggressive, are they likely to copy it? And what they found was that they did. The adults that were dressed as the cat, the children still copied that behaviour. And this was the 60s. This was as more and more people were starting to get TVs and things. So it was quite an important finding at the time. This comes up time and time again now when we talk about kind of classifications of movies, and whenever a new Call of Duty comes out, they use this sort of research and say, well, is it actually making people aggressive or not? Another of the variations is where the children, after the adult had acted aggressively, they either saw the adult being rewarded for that, saying, well done, you acted really well, or they saw them being punished for that behaviour, the adult being punished, saying, well, what were you doing, why did you do that, almost being shouted at by another adult. And what they found was, again, maybe unsurprisingly, knowing what you now know of operant conditioning, if the children saw the adult being praised, they were more likely to copy the behaviour, and if they saw the adult being punished, they were less likely to copy the behaviour. So some really, really important findings there. What I think, so I've presented you with the information, what you need to start thinking about, and what we'll explore more in class, is kind of how does this then relate to the theory. So this was a bit of research. How can you then relate that to the social learning theory, those key terms that we looked at before? So where does the imitation come in here? What was the modelling? What was the identification? Was there vicarious reinforcement? Was there any cognitive mediational processes happening in either the original study or the variations of the study? Finally, we need to evaluate the social learning theory. So we'll look at some of the AO3 evaluative points. So starting with some of the strengths of the theory then, what's the good thing about this social learning theory, learning through observation? Well, one of the strengths is the application, and there are lots of real-world applications to this theory. So for example, with crime and criminals, especially juvenile criminals, how can we use a social learning theory in that situation? Well, how it has been used is that what they tend to do as a bit of restorative justice, they try to kind of pair up juvenile criminals with more positive role models in the hope that these children will then copy the more positive behaviour, and so you see that as being a real world application of this theory. And so it's a good thing if there are applications of the theory, because it says that the theory is correct and can actually be used. Other ways that the theory's been applied is in explaining, and this will come up again in some of the other topics that you look at in psychology, but explaining maybe cultural variations. Okay, so if we take attachment, that's one of the other topics you're going to look at. How do children get attached to their parents? Now that changes through different countries and different cultures, and as I say, you'll see that later on in the course. But one good explanation of how that might change is maybe through social learning theory, and so the children obviously observe the behaviour of their parents, and they might mimic that behaviour. So that's one positive AO3 point, is that there are lots of applications to the social learning theory. Another strength is that there tends to be a fair bit of support for the social learning theory. So we've already looked at Bandura's Bobo doll experiment. There's lots of other bits of research. There's one example here, Fox and Bailenson. Excuse me. And what happened in this study is they gave people a computer game to play, and when they were playing that computer game, what they did, participants were either playing with a character that looked like themselves. I had to really think there to not say playing with themselves. Playing with a character that looked like themselves, or a character that looked different to themselves. And what the aim of the game, they had to either they were loitering around and not doing much, or they were being quite active and doing more exercise. And what they actually found was the participants who played with a character that looked like themselves and took part in the activity in the game, over the next 24 hours, they found that those participants were more active. Okay, so that again supports this social learning theory. It shows that we're influenced by what we observe. It again supports specifically the idea of identification. So obviously they've identified with this character because it actually does look like them, and so this supports the theory. It adds weight to the idea that there's some truth in what this theory is saying. Weaknesses, on the other hand, well, one of the issues is cause and effect. So what this means is, do we know that observing people, does that actually have an effect on people's later behaviour? That's what the theory would suggest. So using an example of this, one way to look at it would be, say, think of a child in a primary school. That child's, we'll say, neither naughty nor nice, quite neutral, and they're then hanging around with naughty kids that are shouting out in class and being horrible to other children in the playground. So what the social learning theory would say is that, well, if that child's hanging around with those sort of other children, they're then going to end up displaying those behaviours, and so they're going to end up being naughty themselves. Okay. However, you could look at that the other way, and you could say, well, that child might have later on developed to be naughty anyway, and so instead of they've learned from their environment, they would then seek out others that are like them. So this child was going to be naughty anyway, so they're seeking out these naughty children, and so they end up being naughty. So we don't know which way it's going, and so that's what we mean by cause and effect. We don't know that one thing is causing an effect on another. And so the social learning would like you to think that, yeah, observing the behaviour is causing the effect of it happening, but it could be the other way around. And that's a weakness of the theory. We can't control, we can't necessarily always state which way the behaviour is going to go. Another issue is the over-reliance on lab studies. Okay, so it's quite, we've said as an evaluation of the behaviourist approach that it's a good thing that it's scientific, and it is, but there can sometimes be issues with scientific research, particularly lab studies. And what happens in a lab study is that sometimes the results, the behaviours we get in a lab, aren't necessarily the behaviours you get in the real world. And so one example of this is, if we look back at the Bandura study, what researchers actually found, Nobel, a researcher, found that children going into the experiment, before they'd even seen the adult interacting with the doll, before they'd even been told what they needed to do, they pointed at the doll and said, "Oh, look, mummy, there's the doll I have to hit." So what that suggests is actually they wouldn't have then gone into the room and hit the doll because they observed it. It would have just been because of maybe the environment, the makeup of the room might have actually encouraged them to act in that way. And so that takes away a bit of explanatory power from the results, from the findings. Maybe it's not because they observed it, maybe it's because it's just what they thought they had to do. This is known as a demand characteristic. So something about the study that, or the setup or the environment that produces a particular behaviour. And so social learning theory research can potentially suffer from these demand characteristics. Another term to use is external validity. Do we know the results that we get in the study, that they are applied to real world? That's external validity, and potentially some of the studies lack external validity because they're so controlled, and that's a bit of an issue with the theory as well. Okay, and then last but not least is the fact that obviously, if you're a social learning theorist, you would go along with the view that observing behaviours, people copy that behaviour. However, what that does, that almost, it negates, it goes against, it underestimates other factors, and one other factor could potentially be biology. So it underestimates biological factors. So if we take something like aggression, which is what Bandura was looking at, and you look at that and you say, okay, well, people are aggressive because they observe others being aggressive. Well, that's not it, is it? Other things happen in aggression as well as observation. So we're not saying that the observation is not true, but there are other things that can happen. So quite a common finding is that males, boys, will tend to be more aggressive than girls. And so, well, if you're just looking at the social learning theory, that's potentially quite hard to explain. Whereas if you then bring biology into it, it starts to make a bit more sense, because there's lots of research and lots of evidence to suggest that the makeup of males, and particularly the hormone testosterone, has an effect on aggression. And so there you get a bit of a whole picture. So maybe aggression isn't just explained with social learning theory, there are other factors as well. And so you just need to be aware of that when looking at the social learning theory. Maybe it's not just the social learning theory, you need to look at other approaches as well. And comparisons between approaches is a good way to evaluative marks to AO3. Okay, well, that was a quick whistle-stop tour. I've not got a lot else to say on social learning theory. I'm going to carry on. I'm going to do another video on the cognitive approach. Please do subscribe to the channel, and then you can have access to all of the videos. So until next time, thank you very much and goodbye.